30 people at that table looked down at their plates. One old man, 40 years of service. One bad knee on a floor waxed too well for his shoes. And the lord of the house stood up like he'd caught him stealing. Every guest in that room did the same quiet arithmetic. Defend the servant, lose the host's favor. Say nothing, keep your invitations. 30 people ran the numbers and looked at their food. One didn't. She was 23. Nothing to gain. And what she said next didn't just humiliate a lord in front of his own guests. It was overheard by a duke hiding behind a curtain. A man about to fall for her for exactly the reason that's going to nearly get her destroyed. Somebody in this story does something they can't take back. Somebody else forgives something they probably shouldn't, and one scene near the end made me tear up. Formatting this script, which has genuinely never happened before. Stay for that one. You'll know it when you get there. Ashcombe House smelled of beeswax and roasted duck, and Lord Pemberton liked it that way. Bought with new money 8 years earlier, kept smelling old ever since. Robert Holley had served that table 11 years. Other tables since he was 11 himself. 61 now, hands steady, carrying 6 glasses across a floor waxed that afternoon. His shoe caught. 2 glasses left the tray for the marble. The sound cut clean through the orchestra. Pemberton stood up slowly. He wanted them to watch him do it. Leave it to the room. Then to Robert, "You're finished here tonight. Get out, my lord, if I may. You may not. 40 years and you can't cross a room without breaking something out, a fork touched, a plate and stayed there. 30 people who'd have called themselves decent. If you'd asked them at breakfast, looked at their food. A chair scraped back. He's served you 11 years, Charlotte Vane said. Not loud, it didn't need to be. And you'd throw him out over a floor your own stuff waxed. To well this afternoon. I beg your pardon. I don't think you do. She looked up at him the way you look at someone standing on a chair. Not someone standing over you. If kindness in this house only reaches people who never make a mistake. It was never kindness. It was fear, dressed nicely. You could have heard a candle gutter. Pemberton sat back down, said something cutting about sentiment and wisdom. And the table found its rhythm again, not the old one. We're close enough to fool the people who weren't paying attention. Charlotte picked her glass back up and drank like nothing had happened. She had no idea she'd just become the most talked about woman in London. And no idea that behind the curtain at the far end of that hall, a man who'd never planned on being noticed had just stopped breathing for a second and started paying attention for the first time in years. Here's a piece of that night nobody in the dining room ever knew about. And it's the first place I want you to actually smile in this story. Because you've earned it after that scene. Down in the servants' hall, 20 minutes later, Robert Holley sat with a cup of tea he hadn't touched, mortified in the specific. Particular way only a proud man can be mortified, not by what happened, but by having it happen in front of 30 people he'd poured wine for without ever once being seen. The cook, a broad, unbothered woman named Mrs. Atlee, who'd run that kitchen for 2 decades and feared absolutely no one in the house, including its owner, dropped into the chair across from him and said, "Well, that was the best thing I've heard in this house in 11 years. And I include the time his lordship fell in the fountain." Robert didn't laugh. He tried very hard not to. "He did fall in the fountain," Mrs. Atlee said, entirely unbothered by his silence. "Fully clothed. Screamed like a scalded cat. I have never told anyone this, and I am telling you now because you look like you need it." He laughed. It came out of him sideways, half a sob mixed in with it. The specific sound of a man who's been holding his spine very straight for 20 minutes and has just been allowed to. Stop. Mrs. Atlee didn't say anything else. She just refilled his tea, badly, sloshing half of it into the saucer, and let him have the noise. That's the part of Charlotte's small rebellion. Nobody at the dinner table ever knew they'd caused not just an old man saved from humiliation, but a kitchen full of people who'd go to bed that night having laughed harder than they had in months, because someone upstairs had finally said out loud what all of them had been thinking for years and never dared to. Upstairs, the party carried on exactly as it had before. Down here, something had shifted, and it would outlast every single person who'd been sitting at that table. Sebastian Wexford had learned long ago that a room changed the moment he entered it. He'd stopped trusting any of it around 25. Tonight he'd arrived early and stayed near the entrance, half behind the curtain, watching the room fill before anyone knew to perform for him. He was still standing there when the glass broke. He watched Pemberton stand. He watched 30 people find their plates fascinating. He watched a woman he'd never met say the one true thing nobody else in the room had the nerve to say. And he felt something in his own chest do something he didn't have a name for yet. Something closer to a held breath finally let go than anything as tidy as attraction. That night, in his study, he wrote to his oldest friend, hand pressing hard enough into the paper that the ink bled through to the other side. "I have spent 10 years watching people perform kindness for my benefit. Tonight, I watched a woman perform it for a man who could do nothing for her at all, because she had no idea anyone worth impressing was watching. I don't know her name. I intend to find out. God help me. I think I already know this is going to matter more than it should." He crossed that last line out. He left it legible anyway. He didn't know yet that the very thing he found so remarkable about her was about to be turned into a weapon, and that before this was over, his own hand would be on it too. By noon the next day, the story had left Ashcombe House and started changing shape. By the fourth telling, the version that travelled fastest, because it was the most fun to repeat. She was a girl who didn't understand her place. Her father, Edmund Vane, felt it first. He said nothing to Charlotte for nearly a week. Then, one evening, he found her in the small library where she read most nights and sat down across from her without being asked. "I'm not angry with you," he said, which was itself an admission he might have had every right to be. "I want you to understand what it will cost, not to frighten you out of it, because I think you already knew, and did it anyway, and I need to understand why, because nobody else was going to. That isn't an answer to my question. It's the only one I have." She looked at him, and her voice, which had been so steady at that dinner table, wasn't steady now at all. "I don't know how to sit still when something's wrong in front of me. Papa, I never have. I know what it costs you. I watched you come home tonight, and I could see it on you before you said a word. And I still don't know how to be anyone else." Her hands were in her lap, and he noticed, because a father notices these things even when he says nothing about them, that they wouldn't quite stay still. Edmund didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't tell her she was right. He reached over and took both her hands in both of his, the way he had when she was small enough to need help crossing a room, and held them there until they stopped shaking, and neither of them said another word for a long time. That's the truth about Charlotte the rest of London never bothered to learn. Her courage wasn't a virtue she practiced carefully. It was closer to a reflex she couldn't switch off, even when she could see exactly what it would cost the people she loved most, and even when, alone with her own father, that cost finally caught up with her hands before it caught up with her voice. Her mother wrote to her sister that fortnight, callers who no longer call, and invitations that no longer arrive. It has taken exactly 2 weeks. She had no idea that less than a week after that dinner, a very quiet set of questions about her had already begun moving through London, or that Lord Pemberton had a far better reason to fear her family than a bruised ego at a dinner table. 8 years earlier, when Pemberton first arrived in London with a fortune everyone assumed was solid, financial architecture that looks, most of it hadn't existed yet. Loans, optimistic ventures. Exactly like wealth until someone asks to see the foundation. Edmund Vane had quietly helped build it, and quietly covered the difference more than once. Nobody was ever meant to know that. Pemberton lived every day with the particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself as fear. It just makes a man irritable at dinner and short with his staff and unable to sleep past 4 in the morning without knowing quite why. On the night his butler dropped a tray, the daughter of the one man who could ruin him with a single word made herself, without meaning to, the most visible person in London connected to his household. That's why the rumors that followed her were so vicious and moved so fast. Not wounded pride, A frightened man making noise loud, enough that nobody looked too closely at the silence underneath it. He had no idea that Winter, alone in his study, at 4 in the morning turning the same ledger pages over and over as if the numbers might change if he stared at them long enough, that his plan was about to draw the attention of the one man in London capable of unraveling both his secrets at once. Sebastian asked questions instead of approaching her directly. What he found didn't match the story spreading through London at all. A former governess who described a coat given away in secret. An elderly aunt visited every fortnight for nothing at all in return. He wrote to his friend again. Every account I gather of her contradicts the story society has agreed to tell. He also learned, almost by accident, from a clerk who mentioned it without understanding what he was mentioning, that Lord Pemberton's finances weren't what they appeared, and that Edmund Vane's name turned up more than once in places it had no obvious reason to be. Quiet questions have a way of stopping being quiet. By the 6th week, Lord Pemberton had noticed exactly what the Duke of Wexford was asking, and about whom. Charlotte hadn't expected to speak with the Duke of Wexford at all. He came to her during the interval of a musical evening and asked, plainly, "Do you regret what you said to Lord Pemberton?" "I regret what it's cost my family." "I don't regret the words. I was behind the curtain that night," he said. "I heard all of it. It was the first entirely unguarded moment of kindness I've seen from anyone outside my own household in longer than I care to admit." Charlotte laughed, a small, surprised sound. The first genuinely light thing that had happened to her in weeks. "You've been investigating me thoroughly," he admitted, and had the grace to look faintly embarrassed about it, which was, in its own way, the most charming thing he could possibly have done. "I asked your aunt about you. She thinks I'm strange. She thinks everyone is strange. It's her favorite hobby." They talked for 20 minutes, and for a few of those minutes, neither of them was thinking about ruined reputations or watching rooms at all. Just two people who'd both spent a long time being lonely in crowded rooms, finding that out about each other by accident. Word of it reached Lord Pemberton by breakfast. He decided, hearing it, that a whispered insinuation at a card table wasn't going to be nearly enough anymore. Through two men who kept his own name well clear of it, Pemberton put a very specific story into circulation that Charlotte's kindness to Robert hadn't been instinct at all. It had been staged, calculated, aimed precisely at the wealthy, unmarried Duke who happened to be in the room. It took the one real act of courage in Charlotte's life and quietly rewrote it as manipulation. She heard it from a cousin who repeated it with barely hidden satisfaction, watching Charlotte's face the entire time she said it. The way people sometimes do when they've been waiting for a reason to feel superior to someone they've always secretly envied. Charlotte sat very still through the whole conversation and did not give her the reaction she'd clearly come for. She waited until the cousin left, and then she went up to her room and was sick, quietly, into a basin, which is not the kind of detail that makes it into most versions of stories like this one. But it happened, and it's true. And I think it matters that you know it. He heard the rumor from 3 separate people within the same week. And instead of simply doubting it privately, he did something worse. At a reception not long after, with Charlotte present and half of London watching, a woman asked him directly, already knowing the answer she wanted, whether he and Lady Charlotte were closely acquainted. He felt the whole room lean toward him. He felt, specifically and physically, the old familiar tightness across his shoulders that a decade of being watched had trained into him. The instinct to give the room the answer it wanted rather than the one that was true. "We've spoken once or twice," he said. "I wouldn't call it an acquaintance." And then, worse, pressed further, with Charlotte close enough to hear every syllable. "I think a great many people have read a great deal more into a single evening than actually occurred." He watched her face while he said it. He would tell his friend, weeks later, that he'd expected her to look wounded, and that would have been bearable. Wounded. He could have apologized too. What he got instead was something far worse. Her expression simply closed. The way a door closes when someone decides, calmly and finally, that they're done knocking on it. She didn't make a scene. She excused herself early with a small, perfectly correct curtsy and went home, and cried only once she was entirely alone, which her journal records with a bluntness sharper than any description could manage. "I have learned, twice now in 1 year, exactly how many people's kindness has a limit. I did not expect his to be one of them. I am furious that it hurts this much, given how little time I have actually known him. I would like that to stop being true, and it is not stopping." Sebastian didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the same unfinished letter he'd started weeks earlier, the one where he'd crossed out a line and left it legible anyway. And he read it back to himself and felt something close to hatred for the man who'd written it, because that man had known exactly what mattered and had done the opposite of it in front of a room full of strangers rather than lose a fraction of their good opinion. He didn't fix it that night. He told himself he'd find her the next day. He didn't yet know that by the next day, there would be nothing left in London to explain himself to. Edmund Vane watched his daughter come home from that reception pale and silent, in a way he'd never seen from her, even at the worst of the last 2 months, and decided he'd watched enough. "We're going to the country house," he told her the next morning. "Your mother's already begun the arrangements." Charlotte didn't argue, and that told Edmund, more than anything else could have, exactly how deep this particular wound went. The daughter who'd stood up at Pemberton's table without a flicker of hesitation didn't have a single word of protest left for leaving the city that had spent 2 months trying to break her. They left within the week. Charlotte sat in the carriage as it pulled away, and by her own account, did not look back at the city once, though she did. An hour outside London, take out the unopened letter Sebastian had sent round the morning after the reception. Hold it in both hands for a long moment, and then put it away again without breaking the seal. She wasn't ready to know what it said. She wasn't sure she wanted to be. What she didn't know, because there was no possible way to know it, sealed inside a carriage rattling toward the countryside, was that less than a mile behind her, an old butler had just requested an audience with the Duke of Wexford, and was about to say the thing that would send Sebastian riding after a carriage he had no certainty he'd ever catch. Robert requested an audience with the Duke of Wexford. It took considerable nerve. "Your Grace, I understand you've heard a story about Lady Charlotte. That her kindness to me was staged." His composure nearly failed him here. "For the first time in this whole account. I've served great houses my whole life. I know the difference between kindness performed and kindness meant. What she did for me, she did in the dark, where she believed no one would ever see it at all. And I've heard, Your Grace, that you did not defend her when it mattered. I've come to tell you what I know anyway, because someone ought to, even if it's too late to matter." "It isn't too late," Sebastian said, already reaching for his coat, his voice cracking slightly in a way that surprised even him. "Tell me where they've gone." He rode 40 miles with barely a groom to accompany him, roads turning to mud 2 hours out of London, his own breath loud in his ears the whole way, thinking of nothing but the closed door of her expression at that reception and what he'd do if he arrived to find the carriage already gone toward the coast, or worse, already gone somewhere he'd never think to look at all. He caught them at a coaching inn, roughly 40 miles out. Charlotte was standing near the carriage door when he arrived, mud to his knees, coat soaked through. Nothing at all like the composed man from that reception 2 days earlier, and by every account of what followed, nobody in that yard, including Sebastian himself, seemed entirely sure what he intended to say until he was already saying it. "I was a coward," he said, before she could speak at all. His hands, she noticed, were shaking, and not from the cold. "I had a choice in that room between protecting you and protecting myself, and I chose myself. And I have spent every hour since disgusted with what that says about me." Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Her father stood a few feet off, making no move to intervene, watching his daughter with the stillness of a man who has learned exactly how much weight a single silence can carry. "You didn't just fail to defend me," she said finally, and her own voice wasn't steady either, not anymore. Not after 2 months of being steady for absolutely everyone. "You told a room full of people I meant nothing to you. In front of me. I know. I don't need you to have been perfect. I've never asked anyone to be perfect." Her hands, like his, wouldn't stay still. "I needed you to be braver than the room, just once. The way I was, at that table, with nothing at all to gain from it." Sebastian didn't argue with that, though he had excuses available to him, a decade's worth of them. "You're right. I have no defense worth offering you. I only have what I intend to do next, and I would very much like the chance to show you, rather than tell you." For a moment neither of them moved, standing in a muddy inn-yard 40 miles from anywhere either of them belonged, both of them trembling for entirely different reasons that had, somehow, become the same reason. Charlotte did not climb into his carriage that day, and she once that understood clearly, in her own words. "I did not forgive him in that inn-yard because he rode 40 miles in the rain. Any man with a fast enough horse can manage 40 miles in the rain. I told him I would consider it, and I meant exactly that and nothing more. She did agree, at her father's quiet suggestion, to delay the family's final departure by 2 weeks, long enough to see what a man actually does after he says he intends to do something, rather than take the saying of it as proof enough. Sebastian returned to London alone, with no promise of anything, and the entire city watching to see what he'd do now that Charlotte was 60 miles away and in no position to witness whether he kept his word at all. He went back to Ashcombe House, no curtain to stand behind this time. Some months ago, he said, to a room gone suddenly quiet, a story began circulating that Lady Charlotte Vane's kindness to a member of this household was staged for my benefit. I want it known plainly that the story is false. I also want it known that when it first reached me, I did not defend her. I said nothing in a room very like this one, when saying something was the only decent thing available to me. That failure is mine, not hers, and I would not have the two of us mistaken for equally at fault in any part of this. He turned and looked directly at Pemberton for the first time all evening. I've also learned something else in recent weeks about why a rumor this vicious, aimed this precisely, might have been worth the risk to the man who spread it. I don't intend to say more than that tonight. I think Lord Pemberton understands exactly what I mean, and I think that understanding will do more work in this room than any accusation of mine could. Pemberton's face, by to separate later accounts, went the color of the tablecloth. He said nothing for the rest of the evening, not because he had nothing to say, but because every possible thing he could say risked confirming exactly what Sebastian had just implied in front of the very society whose good opinion held his fortune together. He never fully recovered from that evening, and it happened without a single accusation ever being formally made, just the slow, permanent cooling of a room that had quietly decided it no longer entirely believed in him. Charlotte returned to London 3 weeks later. There was no dramatic reunion at the city gate, only a long, closed-door conversation neither of them ever fully described to anyone else, and a wedding the following spring. Here's the part I promised you at the start of this video. At that wedding, seated closer to the front than convention strictly allowed, was Robert Holley, retired, by then to a small cottage that, property records later showed, had been quietly purchased and gifted by the newly married Duke and Duchess, though neither of them ever spoke of it publicly. During the wedding breakfast, by an account passed down through his own family decades later, Robert stood, uninvited and entirely against the etiquette of the day, raised a glass that nobody had asked him to raise, and said only to the young lady who set down her wine glass, before his voice gave out completely and he had to sit back down, laughing and wiping his face with the back of his hand at the same time, unable to get through a single further word. The whole room laughed with him, and then, by every account, most of the room was crying to, not the composed, dignified crying of a formal wedding breakfast, but the real kind, the kind nobody quite manages to stop once it starts, Charlotte included, who by her own account had to be handed a handkerchief by her own new husband and told him through it, half laughing, "This is entirely your fault. All of it, starting with the curtain. That's the moment. Not the ride through the rain. Not the speech at Ashcombe House. An old man who'd once been thrown out of a dinner over a broken glass, standing up at her wedding to thank her properly, at last, in front of everyone. Exactly the way he'd never been allowed to at the time. But this isn't a story where everything broken gets fixed, and it wouldn't be honest to tell it that way. The childhood friend Charlotte had written to that terrible autumn never quite returned to what they'd been. They exchanged polite letters for the rest of their lives, never unkind, never again what it had been. Edmund Vane lived another 11 years, long enough to hold his first grandchild. But those who knew him well described a man permanently a little more careful in rooms he'd once walked into, without a second thought. The quiet cost of loving a daughter who couldn't help but do the right thing, whatever it took from either of them. A cost he never once asked her to apologize for and never once stopped quietly carrying. Charlotte wrote, years into her marriage, "I would not change what I did at that table. I have never once managed to stop wishing it had cost my father less." Two things can be true in the same sentence, in the same life. That's not a flaw in this story. That's the whole point of it. That's the whole story. A woman who couldn't stay silent even when it cost the people she loved. A duke who failed her once, badly, and had to earn his way back rather than simply be forgiven for showing up. An old butler who told the truth when it was almost too late, and who, months later, got to raise a glass nobody asked him to raise, and finally say thank you out loud. If this one got to you, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. The ones where nobody gets through it clean, and the happy ending still costs something. Subscribe if you want more like it. Tell me honestly, could you have forgiven Sebastian after that reception? The way Charlotte nearly didn't. And be honest about Robert's toast too. Did that one get you? Every time I ask, this comment section splits right down the middle on the first question, and agrees completely on the second. I read everyone. There's another story like this waiting for you right now. Click the video on screen. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Thanks for watching. See you on the next story.